The limousine smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne. Richard Morrison didn't even notice the coldness on his fingertips as he folded the Wall Street Journal. Outside, New York was waking up, but his world was turning at a different rhythm. 6:47 a.m. The driver was following the usual route, straight from the Upper East Side to the financial district. Richard's eyes lingered on the newspaper's headline. Oil crisis deepens. Wall Street sounds the alarm. He turned the page. He read these headlines every day. They were all the same story. But today felt different. When the limousine pulled up to the curb, Richard looked at the gleaming surface of his shoes. Handmade Italian leather, $340. He'd bought them last week. As he opened the door and stepped out, the New York morning air hit his face. It was cold, but it wasn't the harshness of the air that sent a shiver down his spine. The city was changing. Or perhaps it already had and he hadn't noticed. He looked at the people walking down the street. Most were tired. Some were queuing for their morning coffee. Others were rushing out of the subway. Richard's world was different from theirs, or so he thought. As he entered the marble lobby of the office building on Trinity Place, the security guard gave his usual greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison." Richard nodded but said nothing. He noticed the commotion around him as he walked towards the elevator. Some faces were familiar, some unfamiliar. Everyone was rushing somewhere. As the elevator doors closed, Richard looked at himself in the mirror. He was 42, but he looked younger, or so he thought. His hair was combed back, his suit impeccable. His cufflinks were gold, real gold. When he reached the 17th floor, the atmosphere in the office was different than usual. There was silence, but it wasn't a normal silence. It was a tense silence. His secretary, Linda, was sitting at her desk, but she wasn't on the phone. She was just looking at the screen. As Richard passed her, he said, "Good morning, Linda." When Linda looked up, there was something in her eyes. Was it fear, anxiety? "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Kaplan is waiting for you." Richard paused. "When did he call?" Linda swallowed. "He didn't call. He arrived before you did. He's waiting in your office." Robert Kaplan was one of the founding partners of Morrison and Kaplan Investment Bank. He was 68 years old and had hired Richard 10 years earlier. He was his mentor, his friend, almost a father figure. But his waiting in Richard's office at 7:15 a.m. was unusual. When Richard opened the door, Kaplan was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the outside. "Robert?" Richard's voice was indistinct. Kaplan didn't turn. "How many years has it been, Richard? How long have you been working here?" Richard placed his briefcase on the desk. 10 years. You know?" Kaplan finally turned. His face was tired. There were purplish shadows under his eyes. 10 years. And what have you seen in those 10 years? Richard was confused. "What do you mean?" Kaplan leaned closer to the desk. "This city is collapsing, Richard. We are collapsing. Today. Today, everything ends." The words hung in the air. Richard's heart began to race. "What ends?" Kaplan tossed the file onto the desk. "Lehman Brothers collapsed. Last night. The dominoes started falling. And we're one of the falling dominoes." Richard opened the file. Numbers, graphs, red marks. Everything was filled with negative signs. This can't be true." Kaplan slumped into his chair. "We're closing this afternoon, Richard. We're done." It was 8:00 a.m. and panic had begun in the office. Phones were ringing, but no one answered. Brokers weren't even looking at their screens. Some were crying. Some had started packing their desks into boxes. Richard sat at his desk, but couldn't move. 10 years. A 10-year career. A $2 million portfolio. Private memberships. Country club. Summer house. Mansion in Connecticut. His daughter's private school fees. His wife's society gatherings. Everything depended on this business. Everything depended on this desk, this screen, these numbers. Linda knocked on the door. "Mr. Morrison, your wife called. She wanted you to call back." Richard looked at the phone. How was he going to tell her? How was he going to explain it? Tell me, I'll call you later. Linda left but didn't close the door. The chaos continued outside. Richard went to the window. Wall Street below was crowded. People were walking, running, standing. Some knew, some didn't, but they all lived in the same city. They were all in the same crisis. At 10:30, everyone had gathered in the meeting room. 73 employees. Some had been there for 20 years. Some had started 6 months ago. When Kaplan stepped up to the podium, the room fell completely silent. "I'm sorry I have to say goodbye to you." His voice trembled. "This economic crisis has hit us too. As of today, Morrison and Kaplan Investment Bank is ceasing operations. You are all being laid off. Your severance pay will be deposited into your accounts. Thank you for your understanding." That was it. The 30-year-old company was history in 30 seconds. Richard stood in the hallway. Employees streamed past him. Some were crying. Some were angry. Some just walked out silently. When Linda came up to him, her eyes were red. "What are we going to do now?" Richard couldn't look at her. "I don't know, Linda. I really don't know." Linda walked away. Richard went back to his office. A picture frame sat on his desk. Karen and Emily, his wife and daughter. It had been taken last summer in the Hamptons. The sun, the beach, the smiles, everything was perfect. Or so it seemed. It was 12:47 p.m. When Richard left the office, the building's lobby was almost empty. The security guard was still there, but he didn't look at Richard. When he went outside, New York was packed with lunchtime crowds. People were going to lunch. Life went on, but Richard's life had stopped. He started walking down Trinity Place. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked. The streets were crowded. Cars honked their horns. Vendors shouted. Everything was normal. But for Richard, nothing was normal. The limousine was gone. The company car was gone. Richard decided to go down to the subway. How many times had he ridden the subway in his life? Perhaps never since his college years. He looked at the people around him as he descended the stairs. Tired faces, worn clothes, heavy bags. These were real New Yorkers. Richard's was a fake New York, or so it felt now. He bought the tokens, 50 cents. The money in his pocket was enough. It was strange. At 6 a.m., he was in a limousine. Now he was buying tokens on the subway. The platform was crowded. Richard stepped aside and waited. He looked at the darkness above the tracks. The subway was approaching. The noise rose underground. When the train arrived, the doors opened, and a flood of people poured out. Richard stepped inside. There was no place to sit. He held onto the railing. The man next to him was reading a newspaper. The sports page. The Mets game. Richard looked at the headlines. Economic crisis deepens. Thousands lose their jobs. It was his story, but his name wasn't in the newspaper. The train started moving. The underground tunnels were dark. Richard saw his reflection in the window. The suit was still impeccable, but it no longer meant anything. The tie was now just a piece of fabric. The cufflinks were gold, but worthless. Everything was worthless. When the train stopped at the station, some people got off. Some got on. Richard still stood there. Where was he going? Home? He wasn't ready yet. What was he going to tell Karen? The train was heading towards Harlem. Richard had never gone this far north. At least not in years. Maybe in his youth. Maybe in college. But ever since, Harlem had been just a name to him. A neighborhood. A place on a map. But now he was going there. Why, he didn't know. Maybe he was running away. Maybe he was searching for the truth. He got off at the 125th Street stop. He gasped as he climbed the steps. When he stepped outside, it was another world. The streets were different. The buildings were different. The people were different. Music filled the air. Soul music played on the radio. Curtis Mayfield. Marvin Gaye. Street vendors had set up their stalls. Vegetables, fruit, books, records, everything. Children were playing basketball in the street. The ball bounced on the asphalt. Laughter echoed. Richard stopped on the sidewalk. He stood out in his suit. Some people looked at him, curious, suspicious, indifferent. Richard continued walking. On one corner was a small restaurant. It read, Mama's Kitchen. The display window wasn't dirty, but it looked old. Richard walked in. It was warm. There was the smell of food. Fried chicken, potatoes, steak and sauce. The smell of real food, different from the expensive restaurants. An old woman stood behind the counter. She must have been 65 or 67. "What would you like, son?" she asked. Her voice was warm. Richard looked at the menu. One fried chicken, please." The woman smiled. "Sit down. I'll bring it right away." Richard sat at a table in the corner. The restaurant was half full. Construction workers, elderly couples, young mothers. Everyone was eating, talking, laughing. Richard looked around. Nobody here knew him. Nobody cared who he was. It was peaceful. For the first time that day, he breathed easily. When the woman brought the plate, she placed it in front of Richard. "Here, enjoy your meal." Richard said, "Thank you." The woman left, but she watched Richard. As if she knew what Richard had lost that day. The chicken was hot, tender, delicious. Richard noticed his hands, trembling as he lifted his fork. Why were they trembling? Was he tired? Was he scared? Or was he feeling reality for the first time? He looked out the window as he ate his meal. Life went on in the street. Children were playing. Women were going to the market. Men were smoking cigarettes on the corner. None of them cared about Wall Street. None of them cared about Richard's world, because they had their own worlds, and perhaps that world was more real. When he finished his meal, he asked for the bill. $3.50, the woman said. Richard pulled out his wallet. Inside were $20 bills. He handed her one. The woman brought the change, but Richard said, "Take your change." The woman was surprised. "Are you sure, son?" Richard smiled. For the first time that day, he truly smiled. "I'm sure. Thank you. It was a wonderful meal." The woman put her hand on Richard's shoulder. "Good luck. Whatever you're going through, you'll get through it." Richard's eyes welled up. How had she known? When he went outside, the air had cooled. It was 3:47 p.m. Richard continued walking down the street. He passed old apartment buildings. The staircases were worn. The paint was peeling. But there were flowers on the balconies. There were curtains in the windows. People were living there. Richard thought of his own apartment on the Upper East Side. 6 bedrooms, with a view, expensive, but empty, cold, fake. Here, in these dilapidated apartments, perhaps there was more life, perhaps more reality. He saw a park, Marcus Garvey Park. He walked through the gate. Children were swinging on the swings. Old people were sitting on benches. Young people were playing basketball on the court. Richard sat down on an empty bench. The sun was beginning to set. The New York sky was orange and pink. Richard looked at the sky. How long had it been since he'd looked at the sky? How long had it been since he'd looked at anything? Just looked at it. Everything was a rush. Everything was numbers. Everything was deals. But this moment was just a moment. An old man sat down on the bench next to him. He was black. His hair was turning white. He had a newspaper in his hand. "Beautiful evening?" he said to Richard. Richard nodded. "Yes, really beautiful." The man opened his newspaper. "This world is crazy, son. One day you're up, the next day you're down. But the important thing is that you're still standing." Richard looked at the man. "How do you manage that?" The man smiled. "I wake up in the morning. That's enough. Everything else is a bonus." It was 5. Richard decided to go home. But how? The subway. Again the subway. He walked towards the station. This time he felt different. The panic of the morning was gone. The despair of the morning was gone. He still felt like he'd lost everything. He was still unemployed. He still didn't know how to tell his wife. But something had changed. Perhaps something inside him had broken. Or perhaps for the first time, something had happened. He had seen himself. He had truly seen himself. The train was crowded as he boarded. People returning from work. Tired faces, heavy steps. Richard was now one of them. He wasn't a briber. He wasn't a manager. He was just a man traveling on the subway. The lights of the tunnels filtered through the train windows. Richard looked at his reflection. His suit was wrinkled. His tie was loose. But there was something different in his eyes. Perhaps for the first time he could look into his own eyes. He got off at the Upper East Side station. The streets were familiar, clean, safe, trees. He lived here. He had lived here for 10 years, but he had never felt like he belonged. When he reached the apartment building, the doorman said, "Good evening, Mr. Morrison." Richard replied, but his voice was indistinct. He got into the elevator. He went up to the 8th floor. He stopped in front of the door. He took out the key but didn't open it. Karen was inside. Emily was inside. They had a perfect life. Or so they thought. Richard opened the door. Karen was in the living room. She was on the phone. When Richard entered, Karen turned around. "Oh, Richard's here. I'll call you later." She hung up the phone. "Why didn't you call? You haven't answered the phone since this morning. Do you know how many times Linda called me?" Richard put his bag down. "Karen, we need to sit down." Karen's face changed. "What happened? Did something happen?" Richard slumped into the armchair. "I lost my job. The company went bankrupt. It's all over." Silence. Karen didn't move. It was as if the words hadn't yet made sense. Then she said, "What?" Her voice was a whisper. Richard repeated, "I lost my job today, this morning." "It's all over, Karen." Karen put her hand to her mouth. But how can this be? You were successful. We were successful." Richard shook his head. "I know, but we aren't anymore. The economic crisis. Everyone's going bankrupt. We're bankrupt too." Karen began pacing the living room. "So what are we going to do? The mortgage? The car loan? Emily's school? Club memberships? The house in the Hamptons?" Each question felt like a knife in her throat. Richard couldn't answer. Karen stopped. "Richard, answer me. What are we going to do?" Richard looked up. His eyes were filled with tears. "I don't know, Karen. I really don't know, but I learned something today. Maybe all of this wasn't real at all." Karen froze. "What do you mean?" Richard stood up. "I was in Harlem today. I had dinner at a restaurant there. I sat in the park. I watched people. And I realized they were happier. They were more genuine. We were just acting, Karen. We were always acting." Karen recoiled. "You've gone crazy. You've gone crazy in one day." Richard leaned closer. "Maybe for the first time I've come to my senses." That night Richard couldn't sleep in his bed. Karen had cried. Then she had fallen silent. They hadn't spoken. Richard looked out the window. The lights of New York twinkled. Millions of people. Millions of stories. Each one different. Each one real. Richard's story was now one of them. The story of a man who had lost. Or perhaps the story of a man who had found himself for the first time. The next morning Richard woke up early. Karen was still asleep. He dressed quietly. He didn't wear a suit. He wore jeans. He wore a shirt. Simple, plain. He went outside. The streets were still quiet. It was 6:30 in the morning. He started walking. This time there was no limousine. But it didn't matter. He would walk. He would take the subway. He would rebuild his life. He didn't know where to start. But he would start. He stopped when he reached the entrance to Central Park. The park gates were opening. He went inside. There were runners. There were cyclists. There were people walking their dogs. Life was beginning. Richard sat on a bench. He looked at the sky. The sun was rising. A new day. A new beginning. Perhaps losing everything was the first step to gaining everything. With his last $5 bill, he bought a coffee. From a street vendor's cart, a small plastic cup. Black coffee. No milk, no sugar. It was bitter, but it was real. Richard sipped his coffee and walked through the park. He came to the lake. The water was still. The silhouette of New York was reflected on the surface. Skyscrapers, apartments, bridges. They were all in the water. They were all upside down. Maybe Richard's life had always been like this. Upside down, wrong, fake. His phone rang. It was Karen. She didn't answer. She wasn't ready yet. She'd probably left a voicemail. She'd listen to it later. Not now. Right now she just wanted to be here. In the park. By the lake. With her coffee. With reality. She hung up the phone. Silence. For the first time the silence was soothing. For the first time the silence was friendly. It was almost 9 o'clock. Richard got up from the bench. Where was he going? To the employment agency? Difficult. But he had to go. He had to apply. He had to get unemployment benefits. It might be embarrassing. It might be shameful. But it was necessary. Richard started walking towards the park exit. The streets were full now. Work was rushing to work. School was walking to students. The city was fully awake. As he walked towards downtown, he passed the shop windows. Expensive stores? Luxury brands. Yesterday these were his world. Today they were just glass. Mannequins stood inside. Clothes were displayed, but they were empty. Like the mannequins, Richard was empty too. He thought he had lived a full 10 years, but he had only been acting. Now his role was over. So who was the real Richard? When he arrived in front of the employment agency, he saw the queue. It was long, hundreds of people. Some young, some old. Some in suits, some in overalls. They were all in the same place. They were all there for the same reason. Richard went to the end of the queue. The man in front of him turned. First time? Richard nodded. Yes, I lost my job yesterday. The man smiled. It was a bitter smile. You'll get used to it. It'll be hard at first, but you'll get used to it. The queue moved slowly. Richard waited for hours. His feet ached. His back ached. But he had to wait. Finally, when it was his turn, he was in front of a small booth. A young woman was sitting inside. She was tired. Not angry, just tired. Name? She asked. Richard told her. Occupation? Richard paused. I was an investment banker. The woman looked up. You too? Richard was surprised. What do you mean? The woman smiled. You're the third this week. Wall Street seems to be collapsing. He filled out the forms. He signed them. The procedure was complete. If your unemployment benefit is approved, it will be deposited into your account within 2 weeks, the woman said. Richard thanked her and left. When he stepped outside, it was noon. The sun was high in the sky. It was hot. Richard took off his jacket. He hung it over his arm. He stood in the street. What was he going to do now? Go home? Confront Karen? He wasn't ready yet. He kept walking. This time there was no specific direction. He was just walking. His feet were taking him wherever they led him. When he reached Broadway, the crowd had grown even larger. There were theaters. There were posters. There were shows. Richard passed a young couple. They were smiling at each other, holding hands. When had he last held hands with Karen? He couldn't remember. Maybe they had never held hands. Their relationship was different. Professional, strategic. Was it love? Richard wasn't sure anymore. He stopped in front of a small bookstore. He looked at the window. There were old books, second-hand, with worn covers. Richard went inside. The shop was small but full of books. Every shelf, every corner, every space was filled with books. An old man was reading a newspaper at the counter. He looked up when he saw Richard. Welcome, son. Are you looking for something? Richard glanced around. No, just browsing. The man smiled. That's the best thing to do. To look, to explore. Richard wandered among the shelves. His fingers traced the spines of the books. He read the titles. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Steinbeck. He'd read them all in college. Years ago. He hadn't read a book since. He didn't have the time. Or so he thought. He did have the time. It was just that his priorities were wrong. He placed his hand on a book. The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck. The story of the Great Depression. The time when people lost their land, their homes, everything. He pulled the book from the shelf. He opened the pages. There was the smell of paper, the smell of old yellowed paper. Richard read a paragraph. The words were familiar. The story was familiar. Loss, collapse, the effort to rebuild. Just what he was experiencing right now. He closed the book. He took it to the counter. "I'll take this." The man looked at the price. $2. Richard pulled out his wallet. He paid. The man wrapped the book in brown paper. "Have a good read, son. This book will do you good." When he stepped outside, the book was under his arm. Its weight was comforting. It was something physical. It was real. It wasn't numbers, screens, or agreements. It was just paper and ink. But it contained stories. Real stories. Richard entered a cafe. It was small. He sat at a table in the corner. When the waiter came, he ordered coffee. "Anything else?" he asked. Richard looked at the menu. "Do you have sandwiches?" The waiter laughed. "Of course." "What would you like?" Richard said. "What do you recommend?" The waiter thought. "Pastrami is good. We make it at home." Richard said, "Okay." The coffee arrived. The sandwich arrived. While Richard ate, he opened the book. He began to read. The words flowed. The story flowed. The Joad family. Migration from Oklahoma to California. Hope. Disappointment. Survival. Richard's story was different, but his feelings were the same. Loss. Uncertainty. But at the same time, there was something else. Resilience. Willpower. The power to continue. Hours passed. Richard was reading. His coffee went cold. He ordered a new one. The sun began to set. He looked outside. It was evening. Time to go home. He shouldn't. He had to talk to Karen. He had to talk to Emily. He had to face the truth. He closed the book. He paid the bill. $5.75. It was cheap. Or cheap according to Richard's old world. Was it expensive now? He wasn't sure anymore. The subway was crowded again. Evening traffic. Richard stood at the corner of the train. He had his book in his hand. He continued reading. He didn't hear the noise around him. There were only words, only a story. He got off at the Upper East Side station. He walked. He came to the front of the apartment building. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison," the doorman said. This time Richard smiled. "Good evening, Joe." The doorman was surprised. For years Richard hadn't spoken to him. He only nodded. But today was different. As he went up in the elevator, Richard looked at himself in the mirror. He was wearing jeans. His shirt was wrinkled. His hair was disheveled. But there was something different in his eyes. There was life, real life. When he opened the door, it was silent inside. "Karen?" he called out. There was no response. He entered the living room. Karen was on the sofa. She held a glass of drink. Whiskey. Karen didn't drink alcohol. At least, that's what Richard thought. "Karen?" Karen looked up. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. "Where were you?" he asked. His voice was hollow. Richard sat down. "I was out, walking, thinking." Karen laughed. It was a bitter laugh. "Thinking. Great. You were thinking while we were sinking." Richard was silent. Karen continued. "I called my lawyer today. I'm thinking of filing for divorce." The words hit hard. Richard was prepared, but it still hurt. "I understand," he said. Karen was surprised. "Is that all? Understand? Aren't you going to argue?" Richard shook his head. "No, you're right, Karen. This marriage, we were always wrong. We always pretended. You lived the life you wanted. I lived the life I wanted. But we weren't together. We were never together." Karen finished her drink. "What about Emily?" Richard stood up. "Can I see Emily?" Karen nodded. "She's in her room studying." Richard went to Emily's room. He knocked on the door. "Come in," Emily said. Richard entered. Emily was at her desk, lost in books. She was 13 years old. She looked like Richard. The same brown eyes, the same furrowed brows. "Hey, sweetie," Richard said. Emily turned. "Dad, where were you?" Mom's been crying since last night? Richard sat down on the edge of the bed. I know, we need to talk. Emily got up from the table. She sat down next to her father. Something happened, didn't it? Richard nodded. Yes, I lost my job. And your mother and I are probably going to separate. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why is everything changing? Richard took his daughter in his arms. Sometimes change is necessary. Emily? Sometimes the old life just doesn't feel right anymore, and you have to make a fresh start. Emily cried. Richard cried too. For the first time in a long time, he was truly crying. That night, Richard slept in the guest room. Karen hadn't wanted him there, but Richard had insisted. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling. Everything had happened so fast. In 2 days, his life had been turned upside down. But strangely, there was no panic, no fear, just emptiness. And perhaps in that emptiness, something new could be built. Perhaps losing everything was truly the first step to gaining everything. He woke up early the next morning. He dressed quietly. He went down to the kitchen. He made coffee, simple black coffee. He looked out the window. The city was waking up. The sun was rising. A new day. The third day. The third day of his unemployment. The third day of a new beginning in his life. He sipped his coffee and opened his book. He continued reading. The Joad family had arrived in California, but it wasn't what they had hoped for. There were only more difficulties, but they still went on. Richard would too. Karen mutfağa indiğinde Richard hala kitap okuyordu. Günaydın dedi Richard. Karen cevap vermedi. Kahve aldı. Sessizlik ağırdı. Sonunda Karen ne yapacaksın diye sordu. Richard kitabı kapattı. Bilmiyorum henüz ama bir şey bulacağım. İş başvuruları yapacağım. Belki başka sektörlere bakacağım. Belki de tamamen farklı bir şey yapacağım. Karen kaşlarını çattı. Ne gibi? Richard gülümsedi. Öğretmenlik ya da sosyal hizmet ya da bilmiyorum ama artık para için değil, anlamlı bir şey için. Karen başını salladı. Sen gerçekten çıldırdın. Richard ayağa kalktı. Belki ama ilk kez kendimi hissediyorum. Karen, ilk kez gerçeğim. Ceketini aldı, kapıya doğru yürüdü. Nereye gidiyorsun? Diye sordu Karen. Richard döndü. Şehre, iş aramaya, yaşamaya, ileri gitmeye. Kapıyı kapattı. Sokakta hava serinmişti. Ekim ayı, sonbahar geliyordu. Yapraklar dökülmeye başlıyordu. Richard metro istasyonuna yürüdü. Bu sefer endişe yoktu. Bu sefer utanç yoktu. Sadece kabulleniş vardı. Gerçeklik vardı. Jetonunu aldı. Perona indi. Tren geldi. Bindi. İnsanlara baktı. Hepsi bir yere gidiyordu. Hepsi bir amacı vardı. Richard'ın da olacaktı, bulacaktı. Downtown'da indiğinde yürümeye başladı. İş başvuru ofislerine girdi. CV'lerini bıraktı. Sizi ararız dediler. İnanmıyordu ama yine de deniyordu. Öğlen olduğunda acıkmıştı. Bir sokak satıcısından hot dog aldı. $2. Ucuzdu. Lezzetliydi. Bankta otururken yedi. İnsanları izledi. Koşturan insanlar. Telaşlı insanlar. Richard artık koşmuyordu. Yürüyordu. Yavaş yavaş ama ilerliyordu. Öğleden sonra bir istihdam ofisine gitti. Danışmanla konuştu. Deneyiminiz çok spesifik dedi danışman. Finans dışında iş bulmak zor olabilir. Richard başını salladı. Biliyorum ama öğrenmeye hazırım. Yeni başlangıçlara açığım. Danışman gülümsedi. Bu tutum iyi. Bazı pozisyonlar var. Maaşlar düşük ama başlangıç için iyi. Satış, müşteri hizmetleri, ofis yönetimi. Richard, hepsine bakarım dedi. Akşam eve döndüğünde Karen ve Emily sofrada oturuyordu. Yemek hazırdı. Richard şaşırdı. Otur dedi Karen. Sesi yumuşamıştı. Richard oturdu. Yemek yediler. Sessizce ama gergin değildi. Sadece sakin. Yemekten sonra Emily, "Baba, benimle ders çalışır mısın?" diye sordu. Richard gülümsedi. Tabii ki tatlım. Odaya çıktılar. Matematik problemleri. Richard yardım etti. Emily öğrendi. Güldüler. İlk kez uzun zamandır birlikte güldüler. That night he slept in the guest room again. But this time it was different. He was at peace. He opened his book. He was on the final pages. The Jode family had fallen apart, but there was still hope. Rose of Sharon had lost her baby, but she had given milk to a starving man. Life went on, in different ways, in unexpected ways, but it went on. Richard closed the book. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. Weeks passed. Richard went out every day. He applied for jobs. He went to interviews. He was rejected, but he kept going. His conversations with Karen had decreased, but there was no animosity, just distance. He spent time with Emily, more, higher quality time, park walks, movie nights, ice cream breaks. He was penniless but happy. Emily was happy too. In November a phone call came. Mr. Morrison, this is David Chen. I'm calling from the community center. We received your application. We'd like to interview you for the youth counselor position. Richard's heart raced. Yes, of course, when? The appointment was set. Thursday, 2 p.m. Richard got ready. He didn't wear a suit. He wore jeans and a shirt. Clean but simple, real. When the interview day arrived, Richard was early. The community center was in Harlem. It looked familiar. It was near the restaurant where he'd eaten on his first day. The building was old, but it was lively inside. Children were running around. Young people were playing basketball. Old people were chatting. David Chen was waiting in a small office. He was in his mid-30s. He had a warm smile. Mr. Morrison, welcome. They shook hands. They sat down. Your CV is very impressive. Wall Street experience. But why are you here? Why the community center? Richard had to be honest. I lost my job 3 months ago. My company went bankrupt. I finally realized that I don't want to work for the money. I want to work for something meaningful. I want to help people, especially young people. I want to make a difference in their lives. David listened. He nodded. The pay here is 1/10 of what it was on Wall Street. Long hours, difficult cases, but rewarding. Really rewarding? Richard said, I understand. I'm ready. David smiled. Can you start on Monday? Richard held his breath. Yes, absolutely. David stood up. Welcome to our team, Mr. Morrison. Richard said, Richard. Please call me Richard. Richard was flying home. He'd found a job, a real job, a meaningful job. When he opened the door, Karen was in the living room. I found a job, Richard said. Karen was surprised. What? Where? Richard said, at the community center. Youth counselor. Karen frowned. How much? Richard said, 25,000 a year. Karen laughed. 25,000? It's impossible to take seriously, Richard. Richard approached her. Seriously. And I'm happy, Karen. For the first time, I'm truly happy. Karen nodded. The divorce papers are ready. We'll sign them next week. Richard said, Okay. Karen said, Okay? Is that all? Richard smiled. Yes, Karen, I don't blame you. I don't blame myself. We were just wrong. And now we're finding the right way. You find your right way, I find mine. Karen was silent. Perhaps for the first time, she truly understood Richard. On Monday morning, Richard got up early. He put on jeans, a shirt, and comfortable shoes. He looked at himself in the mirror. He liked this man. For the first time, he liked himself. When he left the house, Emily came running after him. Dad, first day. Good luck. Richard hugged his daughter. Thank you, sweetie. See you tonight. I'll tell you everything. Emily smiled. That smile was enough for Richard. It was 8:30 when he arrived at the community center. David greeted him. Are you ready? Richard said, I'm ready. They went inside. David showed him the facilities, the gym, the computer room, the art studio, the counseling rooms. Everywhere was full of life. Your group is 15 young people, 13 to 18 years old. Most come from difficult families. Some are gang-related. Some have school problems. Your job is to listen, to guide, to give hope. The first day was difficult. The young people were distant towards Richard. "Who are you?" one asked. "A rich man from Wall Street." Richard smiled. "Not anymore. I used to be. But I lost everything. Everything. Now I'm here. With you. Because you matter." Silence. Then a girl spoke. "Did you really lose everything?" Richard nodded. "Yes, my job, my money, my house. Almost my family. But I found it." "What did you find?" Richard said, "Myself." Days passed. Weeks passed. Richard connected with the young people. He listened to their stories. Marcos, 16, his father was in prison. Lena, 15, her mother was an addict. Jamal, 17, was a gang member but wanted to get out. Each of them had a story. Each of them had hope. Richard was touching that hope. For the first time in his life, he was making a real difference. December came, it snowed. New York was covered in white. Richard and Karen signed their divorce papers. It was peaceful, friendly. Emily would stay with Richard on weekends, and with Karen during the week. Richard rented a small apartment in the East Village. One room, a small kitchen, a bathroom. It was enough. When Emily came, they baked a cake together. They watched movies. They talked. They really talked.